Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Fantastic to be here with Venki on this very cheerful subject of why we die. Now, oh, we've got to stand for a photograph. Okay. Fantastic. We've got the thumbs up. Good. So, Venki, I think people might be surprised even defining what we mean by death is not straightforward. And I can think of lots of odd aspects of death. Like, for example, you know, things have been evolving on the planet for 4 billion years. There's been a river of DNA that connects us to our ancestors. Or you can have brain death, but your body cells can live on. You know, Henrietta Lacks died in 1951, but her cells are still alive. So what do we mean by death exactly? Let's get it scientifically pinned down.
Well, it is complicated because all sorts of entities die. For example, cities can die, companies can die. And so what do we mean by death when we talk about us as humans? And it's a strange paradox that when we're alive, millions of cells in us are dying all the time. And in fact, a lot of that death is actually required. But at the same time, at the moment of what we think of as death, most of our cells are still alive. In fact, entire organs are alive, and you can donate them for organ transplants. So what we mean by death is the loss of our ability to function as a whole individual.
Right.
So it really depends on how you define the individual and as a coherent being. And that leads to another interesting point, which is we may be the only species that's aware of our mortality in that sense of dying and not existing as a whole. And it may have to do with evolution of consciousness and self-awareness and language to pass on this idea to our offspring.
So that's an extraordinary thought, really, with the birth of human consciousness.
Okay, we're back.
Sorry about that, everyone. We're just getting to the exciting bit, but so it's a fascinating idea that in one sense, death was born with human consciousness and human self-awareness.
Well, the idea of mortality and death really came up, the idea of our limited existence. And it's driven human culture ever since we became aware of it. And as I said, there's no evidence that other species are aware of mortality. They may be aware of death, but that's not the same as knowing that you have a limited lifespan.
And now we're going to move on to the other pressing question, which is, of course, why do we die? Because there are creatures like a hydra that can regenerate. There are creatures on the planet, trees and so on, that live much more long lives than us. So, Venki, why do we seem to be... We seem to be restricted to about 120 years max-ish at the moment.
That's about right. And there are actually two aspects to your question. One is, why do we eventually die? And the second is, why do different species have such different lifespans? So the reason we die is because as we live, even from the moment of conception, not even the moment of birth, but even the moment of conception, we start accumulating changes and damage. Some of the changes are not actually damage in a technical sense, but they're really biological and chemical changes. So these changes gradually lead to a loss of function in various processes. And it goes all the way from molecules to collections of molecules to cells to tissues and organs and then the individual. It manifests itself at every level. Now, when these changes accumulate to the point where you have a critical systems failure so that the individual cannot function as a whole, then that leads to death. So I like to say in the book, I quote Hemingway, who said, was asked in one of his novels, how did you become bankrupt? And he said, two ways. First gradually, and then suddenly. And so that's what happens. The gradual is aging, and the sudden is the bankrupt's sudden loss of life. So that's the first part. Now the second part is, we're all made of DNA and protein and lipid and carbohydrate and so on. Why is it then that insects, for example, some insects live only for a day, and butterflies live for a few weeks? Then you have Galapagos tortoises, which live almost 200 years. There could be a Galapagos tortoise around today that might actually have seen Darwin, when he came to visit the islands. That's an amazing idea. And then you have some sharks that live for over 400 years. So the reason is very interesting. It's because evolution does not care how long you live. Evolution simply selects for your ability to pass on your genes. Now, in the natural history of...
I like this sex-death connection.
Yes, that's right. I like to joke that sex is death is the price we pay for sex, is something I jokingly say. It's not strictly true, but it's sort of true. Anyway, the point is that in the natural history of species, resources are typically very limited. And so the organism has to decide where to put those resources. Do you put resources into maintaining the organism and having it live a long time? Or do you put the resources into rapid growth and maturation and producing offspring? Now that equation is different for different species. For example, if you're a mouse, there's no point in a mouse living for 40 years, because long before that it would be eaten by a predator, or it would die of starvation or some such thing. And so it would die of external causes long before it would get old. So in a mouse, it's more advantageous for a mouse to put resources into rapid growth, rapid reproduction, and producing lots of offspring quickly. Same thing for insects. So on the other hand, if you're a large animal, like a shark or a whale, it does pay to have a slower metabolism. You have a longer time to find food and raise your offspring. So each species has been selected for, fine-tuned in a way by evolution to have its range of lifespans. And for humans, as you pointed out, the maximum we can ever hope, if everything goes well and we're very lucky, is probably about 110 plus years.
Now, of course, everyone's here. You want Venki's tips on how to live a long and cheerful life. And we're going to get there, okay? We're going to work through some of the leading edge science. And actually what I find fascinating is that you point out in the book there's something like 700 startups all dedicated to longevity and defying death. Venki, what is it about aging tech bros in California who are worth billions and their obsession with death?
I know. I think, at least I hope tech billionaires in India are slightly different. But anyway, the tech billionaires in California, I think they enjoy their lives so much. And Antonio Regalado made a very funny comment. He said when they were young, they wanted to be rich. But now that they're rich, they want to be young. Also, I like to joke that many of them are middle-aged men, often married to younger women. So there's a real incentive for them not to die, or not to age. So,
is this your first tip, by the way, Venki?
Actually, I'm not kidding. We can get to that later about economic disparities. But it is true that one of the best ways to live longer is to be rich. It turns out if you're rich, you have a much better chance of living longer. There's huge economic disparities in longevity. But
just make a few billion, everyone, okay? It's simple.
But getting back to the point about these tech billionaires, I think, they're used to control, they're used to things moving rapidly in the field of computer science and digital technology. And they're impatient, and so they can't buy youth, but what they can do is buy research. And so they're investing heavily in longevity research.
Now, when we look at the start of the book, you've got an image of the anatomy of a cell and various structures in the cell. And people are focusing research on various cellular elements and other aspects. Let's go through a few of them and just get your take on the state of play. Now, of course, you won your Nobel Prize, and you described this in your enthralling book, The Gene Machine, for unraveling the structure of this amazing molecular machine called the ribosome, which basically turns your genes into flesh and blood. And I know it's not one of the main areas of anti-aging research, but you said that there's this gradual degradation and so on. Is there any mileage? Are you not tempted, Venki, to set up a startup to do some ribosome engineering to live a bit longer?
No, I think engineering ribosomes for longevity is not really a thing. But it is true that the way the cell responds to certain kinds of stress is to shut down protein synthesis, and that does involve the ribosome. And I do have, I'm actually going to retire fairly soon, but one of the last projects in my lab does have a more direct connection with aging, because it has to do with how these stresses that we face as we get older involve shutting down protein synthesis. It's called the integrated stress response. But that's just one of the many aspects of aging. So aging involves various changes at every level, from our DNA to our chromosomes to the cells in which they exist, the molecules in the cell, and also the way cells communicate. So there's lots of levels of aging.
I mean, it makes it sound such a tough problem, because, as you're saying, there's degradation through the whole system. But let's start off at the DNA level. There's been lots of studies on model organisms. These are basically organisms that scientists spend a lot of time investigating. Nematode worms, fruit flies. And we've got there's lots of efforts to breed long-lived strains, and we're getting a few insights into the genes that seem to be playing a key role. Are we getting any clues there about how to define aging?
We're getting clues, but what is not absolutely clear is whether these mutations, for example, there are mutations in worms that allow a worm to live twice as long as a normal worm. And so you think, aha, this is a key point. If we were to engineer something, I don't think we're going to start cloning humans or mutating humans by genetic engineering to do that. But the problem is that these mutant worms, there's no such thing as a free lunch. They live longer, but if you take these mutant worms and put them in a petri dish with wild-type worms, they very quickly get outcompeted, because when they're young, they're not as vibrant and healthy and grow as rapidly and mature as fast as wild-type worms. So there is a cost to it. They're only living twice as long in isolation.
In fact, it does remind me that we're obsessed about living longer, but really we should be more obsessed, I think, about quality of life to
Well,
death.
the worm people point out that these aging worms actually, Cynthia Kenyon used to call them frisky, that the worms were even frisky in their old age.
I love this. How do you, Venki, define a frisky worm?
Well, it moves around a lot. It's it's not lethargic. It's not lethargic. It doesn't act like a doddering old worm. So the point is that people did think that this was a pathway, and it's true that when they've uncovered the pathway, which actually turns out to be a growth hormone pathway, so it's involved in growth. And this is a theme that runs throughout the book, which is evolution will select for things, for example, growth, which help you early in life, but that same process is detrimental later in life, because later in life evolution doesn't care, because you've grown up and reproduced. So one of them is this growth pathway, which was discovered by these mutations. So people are trying to see if they can develop drugs that mimic what these mutations do.
So another cellular component that people are very obsessed with are the so-called mitochondria, and these are, you can think of them like little batteries within our cells, they're actually the ancestors of another organism that merged with our cells a very, very long time ago. They get damaged over time, they run down and change over our lifetime. Do you think that we could put a bit more va-va-voom into our mitochondria to live longer?
I think there are a couple of approaches to this. One, it is true that these mitochondria, which are the powerhouses in our cells, and also the center of a lot of metabolism that interacts with the rest of our cell, they seem to suffer damage almost more than the rest of the cell. So mitochondrial damage really is a major cause of ill health as we age. And so the question is, can you do something about it? Well, there are a number of theories. One is that mitochondria is also where fuel is burned, like the sugar that we take via carbohydrates is actually burned. That's where oxygen is used to burn the sugar to produce energy. And in the process, you get these partially reduced oxygen species, which are highly reactive and can cause a lot of damage. And there was a theory that maybe antioxidants might help you. Now, it turns out that's more complicated than we had thought. But that's one way. Another way is to mitochondria suffer from a depletion of important biochemicals as we age. And could we supplement us with those biochemicals or their precursors? And there are some promising signs that certain kinds of precursors, if we take them in our diet, might make us healthier. At least there's studies in animals that suggest that. But I don't know if we can actually... one interesting thing is exercise, oddly enough, can help rejuvenate or regenerate mitochondria. So one of the best ways to ameliorate the effect of mitochondrial aging is actually to have regular exercise, especially both resistance and cardiovascular exercise. We can come back to that later.
So there's a lot of emphasis on growth here, and I know there's been some fascinating studies showing that in lots of creatures, not least non-human primates, if you restrict the number of calories you eat, or they eat, they seem to live longer. And in fact, I can remember meeting an individual at a AAAS in California a decade or two ago who was on about 1,200 calories a day. And I was there with the Fleet Street Press Pack, and our verdict was, A, he looks his age, and B, it probably feels like he's living longer, because the poor chap was just starving hungry the whole time, and obviously not having a very good time. But is there any, I mean, first of all, would calorie restriction get us very far? And then could we mimic it with a drug in some way?
So caloric restriction is where you give an animal the bare number of calories it needs to live a healthy life, which is, it's not starving, it's not losing weight, it's a steady weight, and so on. And they found in many animals that if you restrict calories, the calorically restricted animals resemble younger animals, and by many criteria, both biochemical and sort of visual criteria. So, and that's been true in many different species. So the question is whether we can adopt that. Well, adopting caloric restriction in humans has, as Roger just said, a lot of problems. You know, you're hungry all the time, you feel cold, there's apparently also loss of libido. So all of the things that maybe make life worth living are slightly problem.
Are we tempting you yet?
So in fact, it reminds me of an old joke where you go to the doctor and the doctor says, if you do these 3 things, then you'll live longer and healthier. And the patient says, really, if I just do these 3 things, will I actually live longer? And the doctor says, well, I'm not sure, but it'll certainly feel like it. So anyway, but there is a real science behind caloric restriction. And what they now know, at least, are some of the pathways that are affected by caloric restriction. And one of those is related to those mutations in worms that made them live longer. And another is a very famous, very important pathway called the TOR pathway. Now, in both these cases, there are drugs which can inhibit those pathways. And so in some sense, they're mimicking the effect of caloric restriction. And one such drug is called rapamycin, which has a long and interesting history. And rapamycin inhibits the TOR pathway, and in animals, it seems to make them live longer and they're healthier in old age than wild-type animals, than the control animals. So the question is, could you then just take rapamycin and that will, you'll feel healthier and live longer? And in fact, many scientists are quietly popping rapamycin on the side. They get prescription for rapamycin for one thing or the other, and then they take it, even though they're perfectly healthy. But the problem with rapamycin is it's an FDA-approved drug for immunosuppression. So it's given to organ transplant recipients to prevent rejection of the graft. Now, if you're immunosuppressed, you're also much more prone to infection. In fact, it also prevents things like wound healing and has a number of other side effects. So it's one thing if you're an organ transplant recipient to take rapamycin. Why would you take it if you're perfectly healthy on the off chance that it's going to give you a few extra years of healthy life? But nevertheless, people do that. And there is a talk that maybe you can adjust the dose so it doesn't have the side effects, or you could have analogs of rapamycin which have the benefits without the side effects. But that's ongoing research. And it's, we need, as with many of these things we'll talk about, what you need are proper controlled trials. And the problem is people aren't willing to wait for them because they take a fair amount of time.
Take a lifetime, basically.
Right.
I mean, there's actually an interesting cautionary tale because there's a tech entrepreneur in the States who's spending something like $2 million a year monitoring himself at various levels. And he's actually just come off rapamycin because I think the side effects proved too much. But this is
He also he also was involved in blood transfusion.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. This is something called parabiosis. If you connect the circulation of an old mouse to a young mouse, you rejuvenate the old mouse. And it sounds a bit like some
Dracula.
Dracula and vampire treatment. And he got some blood transfusions from his teenage son, didn't he?
He had it's funny, when this observation was made by professors at Stanford, they got all sorts of creepy calls from rich people about, whether they could get young blood. And then companies sprouted up.
I think young people better exit the venue right now, actually. You're in danger.
And then companies sprouted up, and notably in California, which would take blood from young donors and then sell them at a huge markup to very rich people who wanted young blood. And this is all before there were any clinical trials or anything. And one of the companies, the CEO said, well, the trouble is our people don't want to wait for clinical trials. They want it now. So there's all this stuff going on. And the example of Brian Johnson, the tech billionaire, is he decided that he would get blood from his teenage son and he would donate blood to his father. So it was a three-generational intra-family blood transfusion. But then he's a data freak, and so he measures all kinds of biomarkers, and he felt it wasn't doing anything particular, so he went off it after a while. And I'm glad he also went off rapamycin. It's probably a wise move.
Fortunately, there are plenty more ways that scientists are interested in arresting aging, so don't get despondent, everyone. Although you know that you've all got to become billionaires, and then that'll get you a long way to immortality. But our cells have got this fascinating property. There's something called the Hayflick limit, where cells multiply for a certain time, and then they stop. Something called cellular senescence. And there are some efforts. In fact, I saw a drug, an RNA molecule, mentioned recently that can affect cellular senescence. So, Venki, would that be a way to arrest aging?
Yeah, so senescence is an interesting thing because like many evolutionary ideas, senescence is actually important early in life because what happens is when a cell senses damage to its DNA or senses an infection or something, it triggers a pathway that sends the cell into a state called senescence, where it cannot divide and where it secretes inflammatory molecules. The purpose is to trigger the immune system, to signal to the immune system to come and destroy it and repair the site. So you can see how early in life it's very, very important. It's a cancer prevention mechanism. It prevents stress from wounds and infections and so on. But as we get older, more and more cells go into senescence because they become defective, they become stressed and so on. And because this creates a basal level of inflammation, systemic inflammation, the inflammation itself causes more senescence. And so senescent cells, which were useful originally, become a problem as we age. And so there are efforts to ask, can we specifically target senescent cells for destruction, and can that help? And in animal trials, there are some very promising studies. But again, this is a question where you have to have a drug that specifically hits senescent cells, doesn't hit normal cells, and doesn't have side effects, long-term or short-term. And so that's an ongoing process, and I think that's a promising area for research.
So one more sort of avenue of attack on aging are structures called telomeres. So our DNA is bundled up in things called chromosomes, and the tips of chromosomes, you've got these things called telomeres, and they get shorter as we age. And so, thinking very simplistically, if we can make them longer again, would that work? But of course, would there be a downside?
Well, this shortening of, this loss of the, so just to back up, our chromosomes, every time our cell divides, our chromosomes get a little bit shorter. And this reaches a stage until the ends of the chromosome unravel, and then the cell sees it as a broken piece of DNA and thinks of it as DNA damage and sends the cell into senescence, which is why normal cells can only divide a certain number of times. There are exceptions. Our stem cells don't have that, and that's because they have an enzyme called telomerase, which is active, which can add back ends of the DNA when they become shorter. And other cells that have telomerase are cancer cells. Now, the reason that most of our cells have this built-in mechanism is so that we don't get cancer early in life. So it's actually a cancer prevention mechanism. And so if you start tinkering with our telomeres, then you increase the risk of cancer. And you might increase all sorts of other deregulated growth and so on. So I'm not sure. There are people who are very optimistic, and there are companies, in fact, which think that you might be able to transiently turn on telomerase and then turn it back down again. But I think this is potentially a long-term risk. And in fact, Titya DeLange, who's a professor at Rockefeller and one of the world's experts on telomeres, she said you should never mess with your telomeres. And so,
don't mess with your telomeres. Another good bit of advice to the audience here. Now, we've rattled through a lot of scientific approaches, and let me just ask 2 or 3 questions to try and wrap things together, and then it'll be lovely to get some audience questions in the last few minutes. But I suppose just one general question, Venki. Let's say we did crack aging. Let's say we could extend lifespan by 60 years, and not just 60 years, but 60 good years. What are the ethical issues there in terms of the impacts on society? Would we want societies to do that?
Yeah, so there are 2 aspects to it. One is this idea that we can extend life, healthy life, but not extend the years of unhealthy life. And that's not entirely clear, because historically, as we've extended lifespan and dealt with many of the diseases of aging, like heart disease and diabetes and so on, we've also extended the number of years of unhealthy life. And so we're spending actually a larger fraction of our lives with various morbidities of old age than we did before.
Well, I remember that the traditional way of death in the 60s was a massive heart attack.
Exactly.
And that was quick. And now the way of death today, sound rather grim, is you're drooling in a dementia clinic for 20 years.
Exactly.
Let's have our heart attacks back, actually. I don't like the modern way of death.
Exactly. So there is a problem whether this compression of morbidity is actually possible. But let's say we did extend lifespan for a long time. It would lead to And also fertility rates, by the way, are dropping. And in societies where lifespan increases, fertility rates automatically drop. And this is just a function of economics and also empowerment of women. And so what has happened is that societies are living longer, but their fertility rates are dropping. And so what you have is a society that's just growing old, and the same people are just hanging around for a long time. And this is not, I think, a good recipe for a vibrant, creative society. I argue in the book, which many people will disagree with, is that we're most creative when we're young. And cognitive function and creativity declines with age. There's simply a huge amount of data to support that. And so what will happen if we just have all these same people living longer and longer? And also, people accumulate power and wealth and influence as they get older and older. And so, just imagine, we're in 2065 and, you have Trump and Putin and Xi Jinping still hanging around, So you can just imagine what the consequences are.
So, Venki, we've galloped through lots of detailed science: cellular senescence, fixing your mitochondria, turbocharging your ribosomes. It's an amazing thing to actually have someone of Venki's incredible mind surveying the anti-aging landscape. What do you think are the most promising approaches for living longer and more healthy lives?
Well, let me talk about the pharmaceutical efforts, which is, aging research. So we talked about caloric restriction. So drugs based on caloric restriction, are promising promising approaches. There's one thing I didn't mention in the book, and it's an omission on my part, a certain lack of awareness, which are these GLP-1 agonists. So they're originally prescribed for weight loss and extreme cases of diabetes, but now it turns out that they're also effective in reducing inflammation and possibly helping with even dementia. So that might be another angle, but that's also, I would put that in the class of caloric restriction pathways. Now, another is the senescent cells we talked about. A third would be also, we talked about factors in young versus old blood, and if we were able to identify those factors, we might be able to use them.
So you think the vampire approach has a real promise?
Only over the long term. And then, a fourth thing is something we didn't talk about, which is very exciting, which is related to Hydra that you mentioned live for a long time, which is, can we reprogram cells for them to go backwards in development and become stem cells again, because these stem cells help to regenerate all our tissues as we age and so on, and we lose stem cells as we age. So that of course is a challenging thing, how to do that without causing cancer and how to do it in the right way, in the right tissue. So those are all very important approaches. Now, the thing is, we can do a number of things before all these technologies ever come online, because we have no idea how long it'll be before they're useful in humans.
Now, this is the key bit. So the whole audience is hanging on your every word. So how are they going to live longer, Venki? Help them.
There are three things that will help us remain healthier in old age. They're not a guarantee of anything, but one is moderate diet, which is, of course, related to caloric restriction. So you have a moderate and healthy diet. And one thing I like to quote is Michael Pollan, who says, "Eat real food, mostly plants, and not too much." Okay, so that's one approach. And then a second is to complement that with regular exercise. And I would recommend both weight-bearing and resistance exercise, which helps maintain muscle mass as we age, because loss of muscle mass is a big problem. And along with cardiovascular exercise, which helps your heart and your circulatory system. And the third, which people often don't realize, is to get enough sleep. And because sleep is when the body does a lot of what I call waste disposal and maintenance. And so those three things are very important, and they're synergistic. If you exercise, you'll sleep better. If you sleep better, you'll also eat better. So they all impinge on each other, and they also reduce stress, because stress is another driver of aging. And then there are a couple of sociological observations. People who are not isolated, but actually surround themselves with friends and community, tend to have lower mortality rates. I don't know if it's a correlation or a causation, but certainly it's an observation. Another observation is to have a sense of purpose. Now, I should point out my father died in November when he was almost 99. He would have been 99 just a week ago. And so why was he around for so long? In fact, 3 days before he died, he used a heavy stone grinder to make idli batter and, to cook idlis, okay? So why was he like that? Well, he always had a sense of purpose. So even after he retired, he had a number of projects that kept him going. So that's an interesting observation. People with a sense of purpose tend to have a lower mortality rate. And by the way, while you're at it, you should get checked for high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and diabetes, because these are easy and treatable.
So very last question from me. That very sensible advice there, and don't start popping the rapamycin as well. But Venki, I can remember going to a garage in California once, and there was a room-sized Dewar flask full of liquid nitrogen, and the chap next to me said, in this Dewar flask, there are several bodies and about 5 heads. And these were people who'd cryopreserved themselves at death, and they were hoping that science would catch up and revive them and bring them. So Venki, quick question, but are you going to be decapitated at death and get your head popped into a Dewar flask?
I'm afraid this is again mainly a tech billionaire California thing. And the way I think about it is, there's absolutely no evidence that it works, and I think it's complete nonsense actually. But let me just say, there's at least no evidence that you can resuscitate these things. But I think these tech billionaires do it because they have so much money that a few $100,000 on this is nothing. It's like pocket change, not even pocket change. They don't even miss it. So they figure, well, what the hell? If there's even a very slight chance that it might work in the future, why not? It's not costing me anything. I won't miss that money. So I think that's the logic that they use. And some of the, Elon Musk, Sam Altman, all these guys are associated with these kinds of things.
So let's have some audience questions. Oh, we've got a sea of hands coming up. Let's try this chap here. I should say older gentleman. With the sunglasses.
The lady in the front row.
Thank you very much, Venki. My name is Gopalakrishnan, and my interest in what you said relates to institutions and companies. I have always been fascinated that what is it that we can do, and what can be learned from your kind of research to make companies long-lasting.
Yes.
Why can't we make our universities long-lasting? Why can't we make our political institutions long-lasting? Have you got any comment on it at all?
I think the relationship is that the smaller the entity, generally the shorter its lifespan. So for example, a company's average lifespan will be smaller than the lifespan of the city that the company is in. And similarly, the lifespan of a city will be smaller than the lifespan of a country, and so on. So there is some relationship between the size of the organization and its lifespan. But what you can do to rejuvenate it, you're asking the equivalent of stem cells for companies. How do you rejuvenate companies? Well, one way to do it is maybe companies are more vibrant at the early stage. So as the company grows better, maybe you should have autonomous units that mimic early stages of a company and keep that vibrancy. Then you could close down units that are not functional without closing down the whole company. So that is, this is just off the cuff. I'm a molecular biologist, not a business management guy, so
There is a fascinating link though, isn't there, Venki, between the size of an organism, there's a scaling law, small organisms live shorter lives than big organisms.
Yeah, the person who's really pointed this out is Geoffrey West, who's written a brilliant book called Scale. And he's actually responsible for this idea.
Okay, let's have another question. Gosh.
I have a question. Is there any relation between the mitochondria and this apoptosis?
Yes, apoptosis can be triggered by various processes. So whenever the cell senses certain kinds of stress, it can trigger apoptotic pathways. And I'm not specifically sure about this, but I wouldn't be surprised if mitochondrial damage is another trigger for apoptotic pathways.
Some people call it programmed cell death. Let's take a question over here. It's a gentleman with a very natty bow tie over there, irresistible. We must have a question from him.
Thank you for the compliment, first of all. Second, I've been a fan of you, Venki, since you won the Nobel.
Could you hold the mic a little closer to your mouth?
Yeah, I have been a fan of you since you won the Nobel Prize. Sadly, that's how we know
Thank you. Yeah.
most scientists. But my question is, suppose we don't actually become immortal, but we become functionally immortal, such as the lifespan of a single human being is maybe twice or thrice the lifespan of someone living right now. So would that just convert our society into a society of...
What do you mean by functionally immortal?
Like, if I live for, let's say, 70 years, but somebody else lives for 200 years, for me, that person is functionally immortal, right? It will take 2 of my lifetimes to have one of
No, I don't see it that way. I mean, we're already living on average twice as long as we did 150 years ago, but we don't see ourselves as immortal because of that. So I don't quite buy that idea. I think it's a quality, it's a continuum. Okay.
Let's have another...
Venki, your attention to the back, sorry.
Oh, yes, sorry, right at the back. I beg your pardon. Forgive me, people at the back.
Thank you. Interrupting because it's a very important question for the evening. How do you see a correlation between dying and alcohol? There's a lot of debate now about the effects of alcohol on health. Any thoughts on that?
Well, alcohol in general is really, it's bad for you at almost every dose. It used to be thought that there was a dose threshold.
I think I need a drink after hearing that.
But current studies show that at every dose, alcohol causes DNA damage. And DNA damage, of course, is one of the drivers of aging, but it's also a driver of cancer. And in large quantities, it's a driver of liver damage. So, you can enjoy your drink, but you have to know it comes with a cost.
Next question, please, after that very depressing response. This lady at the front here. You're supposed to be cheering us up, Venki. Come on.
Congratulations. It's sort of wonderful to hear, Venki. I'm Dr. Sunila Khandelwal from Fortis and working in women healthcare for last 45 years. So my passion is to work for the women globally for menopausal healthcare. And in this context, as you have rightly said, we have to add life to years, not years to your life. So what message you can give to our women after menopause who is spending around 1/3 of their life and as rising men, women outlive men. So I really want for compressing morbidity and preventing NCDs, and also in relation the role of mind-body medicine. I'm very much into that, and tissue engineering, and of course the regenerative therapies. These are the 3-4 areas which are coming to my mind when I see my women aging gracefully.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I don't have a very gender-related piece of advice. All of the advice I gave, I would say would equally help both men and women. For example, exercise, sleep, and diet, and those other things are likely to equally help men and women. So I'm not sure I have a very specific advice for postmenopausal women.
So I think
one thing is to maintain muscle and bone mass. That's very important. Yeah.
Because the women, they are estrogen deprived. So they literally, their health is at really at more...
Let's have one last question, sadly, because we're almost out of time, and because I feel I've horribly neglected the back of the hall. Perhaps we could have the last question from the back. Thanks. There's lots of people waving there. Can we get them up? There we are. There's a lady in white. Yeah.
Thank you, both of you, for the discussion, and to Venki for the book. My question is, what do you think about the fasting mimicking diet, which is available in the developed countries, not yet in India, but we revere fast in general. We eat twice, that's a different story. But what do you think about the fasting mimicking diet?
There are a number of studies which show that intermittent fasting has beneficial effects. In a sense, it's like caloric restriction, but what you're doing is you're restricting eating to certain periods and having a long period of fasting in between. But there is a debate about whether it's simply caloric restriction in disguise, that is, intermittent fasting simply means you consume fewer calories, or whether it has separate benefits over and above caloric restriction. So I would say the jury is still out on that. There's a discussion going on.
Well, I think sadly we have to bring this wonderful talk to an end. Thank you for those brilliant questions. Thank you to the JLF. We love it in Jaipur. It's brilliant. And thank you to the brilliant Sir Venki Ramakrishnan. Do buy his book. Thank you.